Attention. Attention.
The live broadcast you have tuned into is a pre-recorded episode of the Dudes and Beer podcast. Dudes and Beer is presently traveling the vast void of time and space in an effort to find you more of the best content in the known universe. Enjoy the following transmission, and remember, if you can't be good at it. Grab your beverages and turn up your interweb. Solving the world's problems 12 ounces at a time. It's Dudes and Beer.
Well, hello everybody, and welcome to episode 200 of the Dudes and Beer podcast, everybody.
To have you guys here this whole time, what it's been like to be on the air for right at 4 years now, getting ready to have our 4th year anniversary, and
The guests have gotten better, the stories have gotten better, the fan involvement has gotten better, the follows have gotten crazy over the last couple of years. So thank you for everybody out there who's listening, who's part of the movement, who is part of the Facebook group and tunes into all the stories there, all the news that we share. Tonight we have a very, very special story, and it's not often that I actually write an intro for the show. It's normally just show notes done shortly beforehand, but this is a story about DB Cooper tonight, and I think it's one of the most interesting stories, hands down. Myself working in broadcast, things like that I have ever heard. And when I happened across Marla Wynn Cooper on a documentary about DB Cooper, I had to find her and I had to find out more. On November 24th, 1971, a man known only as DB Cooper purchased a ticket aboard a Northwest Orient Boeing 727 flight from Portland International to Seattle Tacoma SeaTac Airport. The man proceeded to extort $200,000, the modern value of close to $1.3 million, and made his way to the rear of the aircraft. It was at this point that he opened the aft stairwell and jumped, parachuting his way into history and infamy. After an ensuing FBI manhunt and a media miscommunication, the name DB Cooper was given and accidentally surfaced as the name of the suspect. A detail never changed by the FBI. This was an attempt to avoid any fraudulent information that may have been provided and focus on real clues in the case. The DB Cooper case remains to this day the only unsolved case of airline piracy. Tonight, ladies and gentlemen, we get the story of Marla Wynn Cooper, the proclaimed niece of hijacker DB Cooper and author of the tell-all book DB's Niece in the Raw, Unedited. Her recollection of the man DB Cooper that she called Uncle, and how she began to unravel one of the greatest histories in American crime history. Welcome, Marla, to the show. How are you this evening?
Thank you. I'm wonderful. Thanks.
I can't thank you enough for joining the show tonight. Like I said before we started recording, I had to stop you. I was getting goosebumps talking, and even just reading that recap of the story in the show gives me goosebumps to know that, like, you lived this. And this was something that through later research in life from your family, from stories, from things like that were pieced together and have come to a point of what you have found to be factual basis, cross connecting your stories and evidence that you've found with other people's stories, as well as evidence from actual FBI investigators.
Yeah, it's been an amazing journey. It was, it's an epic story. Here it is. We're 40. We're only 2 years away from the 50th anniversary. Technically 3, but in the time since my story first surfaced, which was August 1st, 2011, when I only had my memories. I felt a responsibility to really not know about the case, about the investigation. I didn't want to know what other suspects were about. I wanted my story. I wanted my story well preserved and in my mind. I didn't want it tainted with anybody else's thoughts. But people came out of the woodwork after that. My story made these worldwide headlines. My family members I had not seen since I was a little girl found me. People who were involved in the story from other aspects found me and told me their parts. And, it was as if I stood still and the whole world created a vortex around me to draw in so much more information than I could have imagined. But it's been a real healing journey for me as well. Within days of my mother making the remark she did that caused my memories to begin to surface, I had just gone through a divorce. It was devastating. It was, divorce is not fun for anybody, but this one in particular was excruciating. I lost everything, and I was just in a really, really difficult time of my life. And I just almost feel like not almost. I do feel that there was a higher purpose in me learning and knowing what happened that set my life on a trajectory that caused upheaval to feel normal. And so it's been a healing journey for me to learn and discover the true history of what was going on in our world, as well as in my own world, my own life, my family. So, and what you said about getting goosebumps, I often will sit and think of how everything aligned so perfectly and beautifully for me to be able to learn and know. I mean, the people that God brought to my path, the way that my needs were met while I literally went reclusive underground for about a year and a half while I wrote the story, while I wrote the book, and was hidden away on a private estate where someone allowed me to live rent free for for a year and a half.
Yeah, because it's an endeavor doing something like that. Like if you don't have a place of solace, like a bat cave to be able to get away from humanity in the world, it's a task to write something.
Well, and what a fantasy, to be able to have that privilege of being secluded, being safe, and being provided for. I had another person, one person gave me a place to live, and another provided me with funds. He underwrote the book with the understanding that I would give the proceeds of that away. Of course, the book has, no, till now, it's had almost no publicity to it. The actual, I'll be rewriting my book. There's a lot more to tell in the story as I've learned more about, it's going to sound crazy to some of your listeners, or maybe not, depending on who your audience is. But
don't worry about anything sounding crazy to my audience. Don't worry about that at all, Marla.
Well, mainstream. When I told one of the producers at ABC News, I said this was a government sanctioned hijacking. I went, I can't draw any other conclusion except that he was hired to do this. Here's the evidence. And, here are factual things you can research on your own. To me, there's no other conclusion than he had to have been hired. He was assigned to do this hijacking. And he said, "Oh my God, Marla, are you telling me you've turned into one of those conspiracy nuts? You've turned into a conspiracy theorist?" And I said, "I guess I have."
That's a dirty word on this show.
Actually, and you do. I'm sure as much as research as you've done in it, and that's what I called my father. "Oh, Dad, you're just this conspiracy theorist. Oh, Dad, you're crazy." And I mean, we completely mocked, but our generation, and I mean, the generation after us is even worse. I mean, I mentioned something to some 30-something-year-olds. Well, you're younger than I am. I'm 55. That I mentioned something
Just
about.
shy.
Yeah, I meant something. I said something to some guys I work with, intelligent, educated. They're both from other countries, one from Canada and one from Colombia. And I said something about the news being fake. I said something. I said something about technology, their belief. These two very high techy guys said something about, computers are really, they're about at their limit as far as their power. They're not going to be able to get any more powerful than this. And I said, oh, you guys, if you had any idea what technology is suppressed that you don't know about. And I felt like, their reaction was so swift, and it was like, I felt as if I was a doe being attacked by hyenas. They just assaulted me. It was like, oh my gosh, how do you say that? And then they started just spewing the rhetoric, the narrative of why conspiracies aren't real, and da da da. I sat there and went, oh, Dad, I'm so sorry, because I used to do this to you.
Yeah.
I did this to you.
And
yeah.
It's interesting that you bring that up so early, because that definitely crossed our path in conversation earlier, and I definitely want to get into some of the theories that you have. And now, granted, on this show we typically call them conspiracy hypotheses, because of course until they're tested, they are not theories. You see,
right.
That's how it works. So cool to have a conspiracy hypothesis, but for people to straight out say that conspiracy theories don't exist, if that's the case, folks, we have a lot of people that we need to let out of prison. Who were guilty of conspiracy, that the prosecutor was able to spin a narrative that a jury of 12 bought, that these two people colluded to an ultimate end. So by that definition, every single DA is a conspiracy theorist.
Well, and the origin of the term happened surrounding, it was a directive of the CIA following the assassination of JFK, that anybody questioning the official narrative of the assassination will be marginalized and labeled as a conspiracy theorist. Yes. And that's when we first heard the term. And because, it was pretty obvious that was not, if you looked at the evidence, that there was no way it could have happened the way it supposedly happened. And, knowing, anyway, I'll pause.
No, because I have that discussion with a lot of people. And I'm not denying the fact it could have been one dude, but it definitely wasn't done that way.
Right.
It just wasn't. I don't know. I've shot at things my whole life so that I could eat hunting, and never once have I ever known a hunter to ever shoot at a target that is moving away from them with an obscured shot when there is a clean shot of the target coming straight at you for quite a while. The shot was wide open up Houston Street. It was pretty obscured down Dallas by treetops. So, not like completely obscured like it is now that a lot of shows show. But it was definitely like to the bottom of the trees and not a completely clear shot. So there's some very interesting stuff there, and I'm not opposed to you bringing up conspiracy theory this early in, because it was definitely one of those. It was one of those weird things. There were much like we have the phenomena of terrorism now, terroristic attacks. Since the age of Clinton, and some of the first ones where it was Timothy McVeigh.
Yeah.
The first attack on the World Trade Center in the parking garage, which was oddly enough caused by two Saudi gentlemen who'd been introduced to each other via FBI contacts who they were informants for. These two dudes were completely independent informants, and these guys were like, oh, imagine what we could find out if we got them together. And then they started meeting outside of them and planned this whole thing to bomb the World Trade Center. So it's interesting to me how frequently these stories pop up in the news, things like that. where the FBI has direct involvement.
Yeah.
And that's where I want to go this evening. That's the part of your story that I have found most interesting, is the involvement of the FBI in the case of DB Cooper. And even the involvement that we were talking about off air, that I was like, hold on, we got to hit record and we got to start this show, because wow, it's just going into awesome places and I do not want to lose this. So before we get to that, let's step back into the Wayback Machine and go back to 8-year-old Marla. Let's talk real quick about 8-year-old Marla and what she remembers of Thanksgiving break in 1974, and how that kind of came to be an evolving story for you as you got older.
Well, let's go even back further to when the hijacking happened, which was 1971.
Yes, 71, that's right. I'm sorry, I got that date wrong in the intro. You're absolutely right.
No, actually, I was going to...
Oh, no, I said 71. Okay, I got 71 there.
Intro was beautifully written, but you said, that a man... The media broke the story. It was actually about Dan Cooper. I think it was just your intro was beautiful. It was beautifully written, but he announced to the airline attendant who wrote on his ticket, his name was Dan Cooper. And at that time, you didn't have to show an ID.
He had purchased the ticket under the name Dan Cooper.
Correct. Yes. Yes. And it was the media.
Exactly. It was the media that's dropped the name DB Cooper. And when they were like, "Oh, let's withdraw that because it's wrong," the FBI was like, "No, keep it there."
It was already, as they say, solidified in the American consciousness that it was DB Cooper. It had a nice ring to it, didn't it? But ironically, my uncle went by the name LD. His name was Lynn Doyle Cooper, and he was one of 5 brothers that my father was part of this family. They had an older brother who had died when he was 2 years old, I believe. And then when my father was a really young boy, the family had migrated from Cassville, Missouri to Central Oregon. There were jobs there. It was, depression. There was a lot of logging going on up in the Pacific Northwest. And like so many people, from this part of the country that was affected by the Dust Bowl, families migrated and moved to where they could find jobs and not be hungry. And that was my family. And so I was born in Oregon. I was born in Redmond in 1963. And my father, in the next book, I will be telling more of that very early part of my childhood. My father had been in the Army. He had a full scholarship to Pacific University I know you want to talk about me. I'm going to talk about my dad for a minute.
No. Your dad is an integral part of the story.
He absolutely is.
That's what people don't understand, is like, you can watch the documentary and stuff with you in it, but the actual story here is so much deeper and more threaded, folks. It's so beautifully woven. It's amazing.
But so my dad had a full scholarship in drama to Pacific University, and he was in college, and his things were going great, and he was destined to be a wonderful actor. And my grandmother became really sick. She had diabetes and was sickly, I think, for a lot of her life. But when his father became very sick, he started having pretty severe heart problems as a fairly young man. My father left college and enlisted in the Army to help provide for his family. And my father worked in Army intelligence, and he would allude at times to, even into the end of his life, that he could still be called back into service. And I'm like, "Oh, Dad, why would they call you? You're too old to be fighting in a war. What are you talking about? It just sounds sort of crazy." And he said, "Well, there are things that I'm trained to do and there just aren't a lot of people who are trained to do what I'm trained to do, and I could get called back. And he was very serious about this. And there were a lot of things my dad said that I just didn't take very seriously, but he spoke about that my whole life, that he could get called back into service because of what he was trained to do. And I have theories about what he did. I pieced together enough of, intelligence work and, what happens as part of psyops and things that I think my father was, I can imagine what he did. But, there was always these hush-hush discussions between my dad and my uncle Dewey and my uncle LD. Dewey was the older brother. My father was second to the youngest, and only the youngest brother, Wendell, didn't serve in the military. And then they had a brother, Clyde, who was diagnosed schizophrenic. He had been in the Air Force and fought in Korea. And Clyde was pretty crazy. Clyde sort of lived up in the mountains by himself, and we saw him every now and then and didn't stay very long. Clyde was kind of an interesting character, but LD was always my favorite. He looked, he had the family characteristics of everybody else, but he had just a different look about him. He had much, much darker skin. My great grandmother on my father's side actually was, I know now, at least half Cherokee, I believe. She's not in the rolls. My cousins and I think, where her family was, there was a big massacre. And I think that, she kept her heritage, her Native American heritage secret. And so there's no history, but you can look at pictures of her. And so I think LD had inherited that skin pigmentation. He had extremely dark eyes. They were almost black, and he had really dark skin. And to me, he was very fit and strong and engaged, playful. He was always very sweet and just meticulous about the way he dressed. He was just orderly. The brothers just had something. There was something good looking about them. My parents had a band when I was growing up, and they played all over the Pacific Northwest. They had a band with my uncle Wendell, and my mom was a great singer. She sounded sort of like Aretha Franklin or Doris Day. She kind of modeled her voice after certain great singers of her day. And my father was a wonderful guitarist. My uncle Wendell played drums. Mom took up bass. At different times they played with other musicians as well. But my parents played a lot of the Ventures music. And there was a Ventures album, where the guys in the band are falling all over this beautiful woman in a pair of cigarette pants and this tight white shirt, and she's real busty, and the guys are all falling around. And I thought that this could be Dad and his brothers in this band. They just had that mid-century coolness about them. When I saw Mad Men, which I'm not a big TV watcher, but somebody hooked me on that series, and I watched a couple of seasons of it, and I was like, that was very much the era of my childhood. It was that scene. It was people who dressed like that, people who looked like that, and somewhat acted like that. My family was more apt to be, hunting in the woods and doing things that you would expect families from a logging camp to do. But my grandfather, before they left Oregon, and even afterwards, I believe, had toured with Bob Wills and the Texas Playboys. He was a fabulous musician.
Nice.
And my grandmother got saved at a Billy Graham crusade and made him stop. She was certain that he was, I don't know, she probably wanted her husband home with the family, and I doubt he was getting paid very much. But my grandfather was a lumberjack. And so, they were just very hardworking people. But so I, as a child, grew up with a dad from the time I was in probably the first or second grade. He became part of an apprenticeship program to become a journeyman lineman. And so on the weekends, my parents played music. And then on Saturday mornings, Dad had to go to school, and he would travel to wherever school was, and he would learn about, how electronics worked. He was going to become he was on a path for a lifelong career, and was all unionized. And so was Dewey in a similar program. And so they sometimes lived nearby and sometimes not. But Dewey was very ornery, and something about him just seemed a little, I loved him, but he seemed kind of shady.
All right.
LD, I never had that impression from Dewey or from LD. LD was more of the sweet one, but they would talk about jumping out of airplanes. They would talk about, their service. They would be talking about things around the table. And when my mother or my grandmother would walk in the room, they would just shut up. And, I don't think that I fully understood the things they were talking about at that time. But, it's like I wrote in my book that it was sort of like being the golden retriever. I was just a little tiny kid. So nobody imagined that I fully understood what was going on. So I tended to have privilege in overhearing conversations, and I was a nosy kid. I never was much of a TV watcher, and I didn't enjoy reading. I'm dyslexic. And so it was like I was more there just observing what was going on around me. And I just thought my uncles were interesting and kind of cool. So we lived in Spokane, Washington, my third grade year. And I went to 2 different schools there. And there was a break at Thanksgiving, and we traveled from Spokane to Sisters for the Thanksgiving holiday. And we arrived a couple days before Thanksgiving, I think. We might have taken that whole week off of school. I don't remember, but I know that my 2 uncles had set up a duck blind that I'd never seen before. This shed on my grandmother's property had been opened up, and this duck blind had appeared. And I was like, what's that? That looks like a really cool fort. Well, it was something that my dad and his brothers had built years before. And, they had it out. I thought they were planning to use it because they told me they were going to go turkey hunting. And they were like, yeah, we're going to go catch us a big turkey. And, they're outside, they're drinking, they're discussing something kind of hush hush. And I'm grilling them because I'm thinking, if you 2 are responsible for getting this turkey home, I'm worried, because every hunting trip you've ever gone on, I never saw anything come home with you,
Yeah.
So I'm thinking, I'm worried about Thanksgiving turkey. Are you really going to catch a turkey? Are you going to shoot a turkey for us to eat tomorrow, whatever? And they were like, oh yeah, we're going to go catch us a big fat turkey. And it's like, they were playing this kind of mental keep away game with me. I know there was more to the story than what they were telling me. But Uncle Dewey had this set of walkie-talkies, and I was like, oh, wow. These are really cool. I was really intrigued by those. And they went out walking in the woods, and I tagged along, and I'm with my Uncle LD, and I'm hearing Dewey's voice come over the intercom. And I want to fast forward for just a minute. Sure. Because this part of the story had completely left me. I didn't remember this. I remembered going out in the woods with them and, hearing them talk, and that they had 1.5 miles of bandwidth before through the trees, LD and I could no longer hear Dewey coming over. And then we went back to the house. But it was actually about 3 years ago, quite by accident. I met somebody who had served with LD, and when I met him, and it was in a place I didn't expect to be. It was a last minute trip, and I was meeting some people, and the meeting place got changed, and where we ended up being, there was a gentleman there who said, his wife said, oh my gosh, you're the niece your uncle was DB Cooper. She goes, my husband has followed that story forever. I really want you to meet my husband. And a little while later, this man came to me, and he was injured from a stroke. And she said, Marla, I want you to meet my husband. And I call him the rancher in my book. And he said, I said, I understand you know about my uncle. He goes, yes, ma'am, I knew your uncle. I'm shaking his hand. And he draws me down to him, and he looks me dead in the eye. And he said, I knew your uncle. And I mean, he was just so sincere, and I was so shocked. I thought, what are the odds of you actually having known him? You're, thousands of miles away from anywhere he would have been. And I said, how did you know him? He said, we served together. We both worked for Air America. And I said,
that's one of the most interesting parts of the story that I want you to get into right after this. Keep going.
Okay. He said, I had pieced together that LD had to have worked for Air America, and that because of when the test flights happened for the 727, when the plane was actually tested for skydiving out of it. There was a reason. Even the top engineers at Boeing did not know you could skydive out of the 727. But
it was not an intended result of design, but it was definitely something that was scooped upon by the CIA for things like Air America for clandestine jumps.
I've heard another theory, and I really agree with this. I subscribe to what Mark Metzger, who has done a lot of research on the DB Cooper investigation. I believe what he said, that it is not unheard of for the CIA to commission a specific type of functionality for their technology, and keep that technology to themselves for such a time as those assets might be required.
Well, and that's absolute truth. A prime example of that was how the STS, the space shuttle itself, had to go through CIA approval, and whenever the original designs came, they went back to NASA with a larger cargo bay, because they was like, listen, this thing is not going to be able to fly our satellites up and pull them in for maintenance.
Right.
And like a little known secret, I'm a space nut. Little known fact about the shuttle program, folks: a good 40 to 50% of those missions were classified via the Department of Defense. They did not get their flight instructions until they were in orbit.
Right.
Yeah, good. Go ahead. Yeah, it was not rare for them to commission such things.
Yeah, it's my belief that the 727 was actually designed for skydiving out of. And there were different versions of the 727, and we'll get into that later too. I mean, we read the story of the hijacking, we read the narrative of the hijacking. We really don't read the story. We don't get the story. We get a narrative, and it just so happens there were only 36 passengers on board. Let's just pause a minute. It's the day before Thanksgiving. That plane seats 110 passengers, and there are 36 on board. Something is wrong.